We're going to finish up this chapter by talking about the respiratory system in animals and in particularly humans. So a respiratory system basically consists of several organs that facilitate the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the cells and the environment. So all cells, remember when we talked about cellular respiration, all cells need oxygen to carry out cellular respiration and survive. So all animals have what's called a respiratory surface. It's a part of their body where oxygen is going to diffuse from the environment into their cells. Animals of differing classifications are going to have a variety of respiratory surfaces. So, for example, the simplest animals like sponges and flatworms, each cell is exposed to the environment, so it'll take in its own oxygen. When you get up to earthworms and frogs, they can use their skin to bring in oxygen, okay, along with the lungs. So if you take a look here at the frog picture, okay, frogs do have lungs, but their skin also aids in respiration as well. Aquatic animals like fish and sharks are going to have gills that have been specially made to draw the oxygen out of the water that they swim in. And so they're going to have one flow of direction of water through their bodies, and the gills are going to grab as much oxygen as it can as the water goes through. So fish have to constantly have water going through their gills, as well as sharks and other aquatic animals, so that they get the oxygen that they need. Remember, fish have a operculum, which basically pushes water across their gills so they can stand still if they wanted to. But remember, sharks don't have an operculum, so they have to continue to swim in order to breathe. Insects are kind of cool because they have what's called a tracheal system that runs throughout their body. So basically, they have little inspiration kind of, I guess you want to say holes in their body, where oxygen or the air is kind of sucked in, and then it's distributed all along the length of their body. And each cell is close enough to one of these tracheal spiracles or air sacs that it can receive the oxygen that it needs from their whole body is kind of like lungs. It's kind of weird. Same thing happens with birds as well. They have their lungs and air sacs go throughout their body, and even some of them into their bones, which makes them very light and able to fly. Land animals, complex land animals like us, are going to have lungs and blood in order to transport the gases around our bodies. All right, so because we are animals that are mammals, we're going to talk about the human respiratory system. So there's basically 3 phases of gas exchange in humans. We breathe, we inhale air, oxygen diffuses into our blood, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of our blood, and then we exhale. So inner tubes of the lungs are highly branched, and you can see that in the picture over here on the right. So we've got, basically one tube here that branches off to the 2 sides, and then these tubes branch off into smaller tubes. It's kind of like, tree branches, and so they keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and more branched. So that increases, it makes lots of surface area in our lungs for oxygen exchange and carbon dioxide exchange to occur. So after we breathe, and the oxygen is now in the blood that is in the lungs, we have to transport that oxygen to the rest of the body, and that's what the circulatory system is for. So remember, in the circulatory system, blood goes from the lungs back into the heart, on the left side of the heart, to the atrium and the left ventricle, and then it's pumped to the rest of the body. Now when it gets to the capillary beds, that oxygen is going to diffuse from the red blood cells into the tissues, and we had talked about that within the circulatory system notes. So let's take a look at what our respiratory system consists of. So we have lungs. We have two sets of lungs, one on each side of the chest cavity. We've got that are protected by the rib cage and bordered on the bottom by a muscle called the diaphragm, okay, which is here. All right. Now, the diaphragm is muscle that is going to aid in breathing, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So when you inhale, right, the air is going to go through your nostril or your mouth, down to your pharynx. Remember, pharynx just means throat. Okay, so that's basically the intersection of the digestive tract and the respiratory tract. Okay, so if our epiglottis is not closed, then things will go into our lungs. If the epiglottis is closed, then materials will go into our digestive tract. Okay, so passes the pharynx, we get it into the larynx, okay, which is actually in this picture right here, which is our voice box. And we don't make any noise when we inhale, but we make noise when we exhale, and we'll talk about that as well. After it passes our larynx, it is going to go through our trachea, okay, our windpipe. Okay, so this is the big pipe that is going to connect, basically our mouth and nostrils and throat to the lungs. The trachea are going to, again, like I said, branch into what we call bronchi. Okay, so if you ever had bronchitis, it's inflammation of your bronchi or your bronchioles, which causes you to cough a lot. And then, remember, it's very highly branched. So those bronchi branch into smaller bronchioles. Okay, and those bronchioles, again, branch even further into what we call alveoli. Okay, and it's alveoli, looks like this, okay, that is going to be responsible. That's the part where oxygen diffusion actually takes place, or gas diffusion takes place within the lungs, is the alveoli. Alveoli are lined with a single layer of epithelial cells. So that single layer is going to help aid in gas exchange, because the gas only has to cross one layer of cells rather than 2, 3, or even thicker layer of cells. So when we breathe, we actually go through what's called negative pressure breathing, meaning that we actually don't suck in air. Okay, it's kind of weird to think about because you think that you do, but the way that it works is when you inhale, and you get the signal from your brain to inhale, your the muscles around your ribs are contracting, and so it expands your rib cage. Okay, and also that diaphragm, that big muscle we talked about underneath the lungs, that diaphragm here is going to contract as well and kind of basically go down. Okay, it's going to contract and go down. So the bringing down of the diaphragm and the expansion of the rib cage, okay, makes more volume in the lungs. All right, and so the lungs have now a lower pressure than the air. So if you remember from chemistry, if you increase the volume of something, you're going to decrease pressure. So now we have decreased pressure inside the lungs, and that's less than the outside environment. And so what happens is that that extra pressure from the outside environment is actually pushing air into your lungs. Okay, so we don't actually suck in the air. It's basically being forced down our throats, so to speak, because of the negative pressure there. Now, when you exhale, okay, your rib cage goes back to normal, your diaphragm goes back to normal. We're decreasing volume, which means we increase the pressure inside of the lungs, and that air then gets squeezed out and get pushed out of our mouth and nose. Okay, so that's what we call negative pressure breathing. Some animals actually do positive pressure breathing, and frogs are one of them. Basically, what they'll do is they'll gulp some air, they close their mouth, and they have to physically swallow that air into their lungs in order to breathe. Okay, so it's not like ours where we just, increase our rib cage and air gets drawn in, they actually have to consciously gulp air, basically, in order to breathe. So they do have lungs, but remember, they also can respire through their skin as well. Okay, so in order to control breathing, okay, so there is some kind of involuntary control of breathing, like when you're sleeping, you don't have to continually tell yourself to breathe. But we also can consciously increase our rate of breathing, or increase the depth of breathing, or hold our breath, or take a big breath. So we kind of have a two-way system there. All of those signals come from the brain. Okay, so nerves from breathing control centers in the brain are going to send signals down to the muscles in your rib cage and the diaphragm. Okay, and your brain is going to get signals related to the carbon dioxide amount in your blood. Okay, because basically the most important function of breathing is to get rid of carbon dioxide waste. Second most important function is to get more oxygen. Okay, so when the brain senses a higher level of carbon dioxide, it's going to send a signal to increase the breathing rate and depth. Okay, so that means we're going to get a signal. We're going to get a signal from the brain that goes to our rib muscles and to our diaphragm. That's going to either increase the rate of contraction or kind of make it a bigger, longer contraction so that we get more air into our lungs so we can expel more air out. So remember, the more carbon dioxide that's eliminated, the more O2 that's provided to the cells, the better we can regulate our gas exchange within our bodies. So interestingly enough, oxygen doesn't readily actually dissolve into the blood. Okay, so we need something in our blood to actually grab onto oxygen as it's diffusing through the cells. So that thing is what we call hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is basically a protein made up of 4 polypeptide chains. So we can see here in this picture, we've got an orange one, a green polypeptide chain, a pink polypeptide chain, and a purple polypeptide chain. So 4 polypeptide chains within this one protein called hemoglobin. Each of those polypeptide chains has an iron atom in it. And we can see that it's the blue disc inside in the middle here. Okay, so these are the iron atoms. And the iron has a high affinity, or a high liking, an attraction, if you will, to oxygen. So it's the iron within the hemoglobin that's going to grab onto the oxygens and grab a hold of them. Now, interestingly enough, each hemoglobin can hold 4 molecules of oxygen, right? 1 in each of the 4 polypeptide chains. And each red blood cell, even though they're one of the smaller blood cells that we had learned about last lecture, each red blood cell can hold 250 million hemoglobins. Okay, so if there's 250 million hemoglobins in a single red blood cell times 4 molecules of oxygen, that means that one red blood cell can hold 1 billion oxygen molecules. Okay, which is a lot, but not actually relatively in terms of cells. So it's a good thing we've got such a high efficiency for oxygen exchange and carrying in our bodies. All right, we can't talk about the respiratory system without talking about smoking. Yuck. Yeah, gross. So tobacco smoking, cigarette smoking, cigar smoking, marijuana smoking, is basically tobacco smoke is made up of particles of carbon that are kind of sticky, and they attract and stick to over, I think they've counted 4,000 different chemicals that are toxic and or deadly to the human body. So that right there doesn't even want to lead me to smoke. Remember we said in the alveoli, there are it's a single layer of epithelial tissue lining. So it's a single layer of cells. And so you can imagine that with over 4,000 different chemicals that can be toxic and deadly, those alveoli are going to be damaged by smoke for sure. Okay, so if we take a look over here at the picture, this is nice, healthy, pink, what lungs should look like. Okay, here's the heart in the middle. Here is smoker's lung, which is black and scarred and tarred and gross. Okay, so smokers die on average 13 to 14 years earlier than non-smokers. Okay, so if you want to die early, you can start smoking. Not to mention that lung cancer is the #1 cancer in the United States. Not breast cancer like most people think. It's lung cancer. Okay, and 90% of the people who get lung cancer are smokers. Only 10% of those who get lung cancer are not smokers, and a good portion of those have lived around smokers, so it's from secondhand smoke. So that's the deal with smoking. But it's interesting these days because you've probably seen these things around, which they call E-cigs or e-cigarettes, electronic cigarettes. It's basically kind of a new form of smoking. Companies are trying to bring back bring back smoking, to the workplace and to social areas. So the smokers aren't excluded and have to be banned to sidewalks and smoking sections. What this is that instead of actually burning tobacco, which has nicotine in it, basically you can buy straight up nicotine and put it in one of these, and it gets vaporized, and so you inhale just the nicotine without all the tobacco and all of the other nasty stuff that is in regular cigarettes. So that's cool. That's at least better than smoking tobacco. However, the full risks actually aren't known for e-cigarettes because they are so new. So they caution people, obviously, to not start smoking e-cigarettes because they don't know what, the side effects will actually occur. We do know, actually, from, long-term studies of regular smoking and nicotine, the effects of nicotine on the body. So, in these e-cigarettes, there still is nicotine in them. And so nicotine is a drug that travels to your brain and increases the release of epinephrine. Okay, epinephrine is a chemical that is released with the fight or flight syndrome. So it's like adrenaline. Okay, it's adrenaline. And so you kind of get that, excited, agitated, lots of people like that quote unquote high that they get from an adrenaline rush. And so that's basically what nicotine is doing, is giving you an artificial adrenaline rush. But we got to be careful with adrenaline and epinephrine because it raises your heart rate, increases your blood pressure, and constricts your blood vessels. Okay, so all three of those can lead to hypertension, congestive heart failure, heart attack, and strokes. Okay, so these e-cigarettes aren't, the cure-all, and shouldn't be an excuse to go out and start smoking, because there's definitely still side effects of nicotine. Not to mention, nicotine is an addictive drug. Yes, it's not one that's going to impair your thinking, like marijuana and cocaine and crystal meth and alcohol and stuff like that, but is an addictive drug in your body, which is predisposed to tolerance, meaning that it's going to take more and more nicotine for you to get that rush, that high that you like to feel. So you'll spend more and more on your little nicotine drug habit over the years to get not as satisfying as a rush. And because of that, a lot of people who have had nicotine for a while in their bodies is actually associated with depression. Okay, because they feel like, oh, I'm smoking and I just don't feel as good as I used to feel when I smoke. And so that kind of puts them down into the depressed mode. So like I said, all in all, I guess it's a quote unquote healthier alternative. to actual cigarette smoking, but like I said, we got to watch out for the effects of a drug, because it is a drug, nicotine.